93 minutes is all it took. On the 4th of July, 1918, outside the little-known village of Hamel on the Western Front, a groundbreaking attack was launched. For almost 4 years, the Western Front had been locked in stalemate, with significant gains almost impossible to achieve. But on that day, Australian, American, and British troops would demonstrate a new way to fight. In one morning, a blueprint would be laid, one which would demonstrate that trench warfare could be broken and that the war could be won on the battlefield. But this is more than a tale of tactics and tanks. It's also the chronicle of two armies, one exhausted, one untested, and the unlikely bond forged in the crucible of combat. This is the story of Le Hamel. To understand the importance of Le Hamel, we need to go back in time a little to 1917. Two major events had taken place in that year which would drastically change the outlook of the Western Front. First, in Russia, a communist revolution had taken place, overthrowing the Tsar, and eventually, at great territorial cost, the Soviet government had come to peace terms with the Germans, bringing an end to fighting on the Eastern Front. Secondly, in April, largely as a result of unrestricted submarine warfare, America had entered the war. And whilst not immediately a threat, once her army and industrial might had been built up, she would spell the doom of Imperial Germany. But these two events did present an opportunity for the Central Powers. A short window of time existed during which the Americans were still raising their forces. But those German troops on the Eastern Front, close to 1 million of them, had no enemy in sight. Now was the time to strike, transferring the bulk of their manpower westwards and grouping their best troops into specialist assault formations known as stormtroopers. Germany planned to smash open the Western Front, driving the British and her allies northwards towards the Channel ports and the French southwards to defend Paris. And so on the 21st of March 1918, the Germans had launched their famous Spring Offensive, an all-out gamble to crush the British and French armies in the West before the unstoppable manpower of the U.S. was brought to bear. That first assault had crashed through the British Fifth Army positions on the Somme, causing an unprecedented retreat which had only been stopped, and with great loss of life, outside the city of Amiens. In April, the Germans had tried again to destroy the hard-pressed Allies. So serious was the situation that the British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, issued the following communiqué to all troops. "There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There can be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The safety of our homes and freedom of mankind alike depend upon the conduct of each of us at this critical moment." Eventually, that assault, known as the Battle of the Lies, was held, but at huge cost. Once more in May, the Germans attacked. Again, desperate fighting, and again the enemy were held, owing much to the sacrifice of Australian troops around the vital town of Villers-Bretonneux. By the time the fighting finally petered out on the Somme, the German army's last chance to win the war on the Western Front had in all probability been lost. But this didn't mean that the war was over. Far from it. A bloody journey of many months' fighting was still in store, and in some ways, that journey could be said to start right here at Le Hamel. With the Germans still pressuring the French to the south around the River Aisne, British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig was asked to assist by launching local attacks against the enemy along his front. Amongst those troops under his overall command, holding an approximately 17-mile-long front on the southern flank of the British Expeditionary Force, were the battle-hardened and reliable Australians. Under the command of the charismatic and highly efficient Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, the Australians had already proved their mettle on more than one occasion. Since 1915, the Aussies had fought at Gallipoli, the Somme, Bullecourt, Messines, and Passchendaele. Now once more, they were called on to take the fight to the enemy. Consulting with his divisional and brigade commanders on the 10th of June, Monash's plan was to lead all his units on a broad front when the time for the big push came. But in order to do that, he first needed to capture a prominent German salient around the small village of Le Hamel on the southern banks of the River Somme. By overlaying this wartime trench map onto the satellite view, we can clearly identify the exact positions occupied by both Australian and German forces at this time. The thick line marked in blue indicates the Allied front line in early July, and those in red the enemy positions. Of note here, though, are the thinner lines running far into the German rear area, each of which was a further defensive position. We should make the point here that although for many the concept of the Great War was that of continuous trench lines separated only by no man's land, by 1918 that idea had largely been abandoned by both sides, with the concept of defense in depth being the order of the day. This, in its simplest form, saw the battlefield broken down into three zones. First, the forward zone. This was usually the old front line where groups of men formed outposts or strong points designed to slow the advancing enemy down and inflict losses, but not to hold indefinitely. Second, the battle zone. Once the forward zone was bypassed, the attackers reached this area, which was much stronger defensively and where the main fight would take place, and hopefully the enemy would be held. Finally, the rear or reserve zone. If the battle zone was breached, counterattacking forces and artillery concentrations were held here. In order to achieve success, both the forward and battle zones needed to be breached and held. Here's how this applies to Le Hamel. As we see, this compact battlefield is bounded by the Somme River Valley to the north and the Roman-built Villers-Bretonneux-Rosières Road to the south, a distance of some 5 kilometers of frontage. The German forward zone here is the front line, with a particularly strong point being this area known as Pear Trench and this area here known as Kidney Trench, and then Hamel and Vere Woods, all of which had significant machine gun concentrations. Beyond the forward zone lay the village of Le Hamel itself. From the air, the challenge becomes clear. After making it through the rolling hills and woods of the German forward line, Le Hamel can be seen in the distance, approached today as it was in 1918 by flat, open fields. The village sits in a slight hollow. Defenses here were strong and enemy fields of fire particularly potent. Unusually, for the Great War, the ground here was not particularly churned up by shell fire, meaning that progress could be achieved, but the lack of shell holes meant little cover was available for attacking troops. As we approach closer, we see beyond Le Hamel the main German defensive line in the battle zone, dominating the entire area, known as the Wolfsberg. This hilltop and the nearby Crochet Wood to its south would be the main Australian objectives in the fight to come. So, now we know what needs to be done. What about those men who would lead the advance? Monash had chosen Australian troops from across 3 different brigades in 3 different divisions to lead his assault. To the north, the men of the 11th Brigade of the 3rd Division under Brigadier General Cannon would lead the way, whilst to their south, the highly regarded 4th Brigade, consisting of 3 infantry battalions, including the legendary Australian Victoria Cross recipient Albert Jacka, would make the central advance, and beyond them, the 6th Brigade from the Australian state of Victoria would attack in the south. To understand what follows, a few commonly used terms in the Great War require explanation, what exactly they represent and how they interconnect in the military structure of the time. The section, the most basic unit made up of usually 12 men and led by a corporal. The platoon, 4 sections made up a platoon of around 50 men under the command of a lieutenant or second lieutenant with a sergeant assisting. The company, 4 platoons made up a company officially 227 men, often commanded by a major or a captain. The battalion, those 4 companies, along with a machine gun section, battalion headquarters, and various specialist troops, made a battalion commanded by a lieutenant colonel. It was on paper at least around 30 officers and 1,000 men in all. The brigade. For most of the war, 4 battalions formed a brigade commanded, unsurprisingly, by a brigadier general. Again, with various attached troops, it was about 4,000 men in total. The division. Finally, 3 brigades usually made a division commanded by a major general. This consisted of a total of 12 infantry battalions, 3 field artillery brigades, 2 engineer field companies, 1 signal company, 1 divisional ammunition column, 3 field ambulances, and various additional specialist troops. All told, a complement of some 16,000 to 18,000 men. Added to this number were, perhaps surprisingly, a contingent of American troops brought into the area to gain experience from the battle-hardened Aussies. Mostly hailing from the state of Illinois, the men of the 131st and 132nd Infantry Regiments would be attached in platoons to a number of Australian units. It was a clash of worlds. On one side stood the Australians, worn down, cynical, their uniforms threadbare and sun-bleached, veterans of Gallipoli, the Somme, and a dozen other killing fields whose names had long since blurred together. 3 years of industrial slaughter had stripped away any illusions they might have once held about glory or adventure. They had the hollow eyes of men who had seen too much and buried too many friends. On the other side stood the Americans, fresh-faced, their uniforms clean and crisp, their boots barely scuffed. They arrived with the same enthusiasm the Australians themselves had carried to Gallipoli 3 years prior, before the beaches taught them otherwise. The Yanks were keen for a fight they didn't yet understand, still believing that courage and determination could overcome machine guns and artillery. Monash wasn't just mixing troops, he was mixing different wars. The Australians watched these newcomers arrive with a mixture of skepticism and something approaching pity. They'd seen spirited young men before. They'd buried most of them. "Green as grass," muttered one Australian sergeant, watching the Americans unload from their trucks. Won't last 5 minutes. But there was something else there too, a flicker of something the Australians hadn't felt in a long time. These Americans, for all their naivety, reminded them of who they used to be, and perhaps in teaching them how to survive, the Australians might remember why they were still fighting at all. They were unblooded, but well-trained, physically fit, and ready for the fight. Completing Monash's attacking forces would be the new and highly effective Mark V tanks of the British 5th Tank Brigade. All told, some 7,000 men, 600 artillery pieces, 60 tanks, and numerous aircraft would be involved in the battle. Despite this impressive array of men and firepower, we shouldn't forget that in mid-1918, the Australians, still an all-volunteer force, were drained and now suffering badly from a new menace on the Western Front, the Spanish flu. Those factors made the addition of the doughboys a truly welcome one, as Lieutenant Edgar Rule remembers. On the afternoon of the 2nd of July, a bunch of Yanks came up to be distributed among us for this fight. 12 were put in each platoon, and believe me, they were some men. This was the first time that they had been in the line, and they were dead keen. And apart from that, it bucked up our lads. All the novelty of the war had long since vanished for our boys. They had seen too many shows like this, and as a rule, before such a fight, one now sees only set grim faces. But on this occasion, everyone was smiling or laughing. They were on their mettle, and they were determined to let the Yanks see what the Aussies were capable of. The Yanks were out for information, and our boys were very willing teachers, and it speaks well for the future to see one set so zealous to learn and the other so willing to teach. In the days before the attack, something remarkable happened in those muddy trenches and rear areas. The Australians, men who had stopped caring about much beyond survival, found themselves caring about these Americans. Perhaps it was the questions. The Yanks asked everything. How do you spot a sniper? What does incoming artillery sound like? How close can you get to a creeping barrage without dying? The Australians had learned these lessons in blood. Now they could pass them on. Stay low when you move, an Australian corporal told a group of American privates, demonstrating the hunched, shuffling gait that kept a man's head below the parapet. Fritz has got snipers everywhere. You stand up straight like you're on parade. You'll get a third eye. The Americans nodded earnestly, practicing the movement until the Australians were satisfied. And when the barrage starts, the corporal continued, his voice dropping, you stay behind it. I don't care how slow it feels. I don't care if every instinct tells you to run. You stay behind that curtain of shells. That barrage is your best friend. It's killing everything in front of you, but it'll kill you too if you get too eager. The Americans would remember this warning. Some of them would forget it in the heat of battle, but they would remember it was given. On the other side of the wire, German forces were considerably less numerous, but still not to be overlooked. Intelligence had reported that some 2,580 men of the 13th and 43rd Reserve Divisions were manning the main forward and battle zones, with a further 2,900 men held further back in reserve. Further bolstering the defense were dozens of machine guns and artillery pieces, each well-sighted for maximum effect. That said, by this stage in the war, the Germans were worn thin too, squeezed ever tighter on the home front by British naval blockade. Rations had fallen significantly by this time, and many were suffering from malnutrition. So, what about the plan? Having been part of the highly successful Messina's Ridge attack under General Plumer, and being an innovator and meticulous planner, it's no surprise that Monash and his commanders looked to every conceivable detail. His intention was to split up his leading tank formation into 3 dedicated groups, each assigned a specific objective. To the north, 15 tanks would lead the assault directly on Hamel village, with the troops of 11th Brigade advancing in 3 waves. The first alongside the tanks, the second with a follow-up force to consolidate the captured ground and knock out any resistance points, and a third reserve wave to bring up supplies and strengthen positions once they had fallen. The tanks themselves had even been given dedicated roles. Some would focus on crushing and clearing enemy wire. Some would act as a reserve to replace any knocked-out tanks. And some would even go into action solely carrying supplies for infantry and other tanks, all designed to keep up the momentum of the attack. In the center, a further 12 tanks and infantry would attack the strongly defended paired trench position. To the south, a final group of 15 Markfursers would head for Hamel and Wehrwood with the 6th Brigade in tow. All this would take place with even more innovative support. Firing ahead of the advancing troops, neutralizing enemy artillery batteries and strong points with a closely timed creeping barrage would be British and French heavy artillery, which crucially would not fire a preparatory bombardment, thus maintaining the element of surprise to the very last moment. It had been decided to further aid the attack that 1 in every 10 artillery rounds fired would be a smoke shell, shielding the advancing troops from enemy vision. Even aircraft were to be employed, some spotting and correcting artillery fire, others strafing German positions. Some solely dedicated to drowning out the noise of the advancing tanks, and others even employed to drop supplies to advancing tanks and infantry, keeping with the idea of innovation and to improve all arms cooperation on the ground, especially given the negative experience many Aussies had had with tanks in the fighting at Bullecourt. All troops were removed from the front lines before the assault. They were given opportunities to train together, learn to cooperate on the battlefield, and generally understand the role each other had to play. And here, in those training grounds behind the lines, the real bond between Australian and American began to form. The Australians showed the Americans how to work with the tanks, those terrifying metal beasts that could crush wire and men with equal indifference. They taught them the hand signals, the timing, the rhythm of an assault. "The tank goes first," explained a sergeant from the 44th Battalion. "He draws the fire, crushes the wire. You follow in his shadow. When he stops, you go around. When he moves, you move. Think of him as a big, ugly mate who's there to help you, but who doesn't give a damn if he steps on your foot." The Americans practiced until the movements became instinct. They learned the sounds of different shells, the whine of a dud, the crack of shrapnel, the earth-shaking thump of a heavy. They learned that a man who freezes dies, but a man who panics dies faster. And in the quiet moments around fires in the rear areas, the two groups of soldiers found common ground. The Australians told stories of Gallipoli and the Somme. The Americans talked about home, about Chicago and farms in Illinois and the families they'd left behind. For a few brief days, the Australians remembered what it felt like to hope. To further aid preparation, a series of enormous scale models of the battlefield were created behind the lines in exquisite detail, which men had the chance to study, learn their specific roles and objectives, identify landmarks, and be fully prepared for the assault to come. Even camera crews were present to capture the scenes. The Americans gathered around these models with the same intensity they brought to everything, memorizing every feature, asking questions, pointing at objectives. "That's the Wolfsburg," an Australian officer explained, tapping the model hill. "That's where we stop. If we take that, we've won. Everything between here and there is just the road to get us there. All of these features, which may seem like simple common sense today, were innovative for the time and would in reality lead to real success on the battlefield. In short, nothing was left to chance. Finally, training complete, the date and time of the attack was set for 3:10 a.m. on the 4th of July, 1918. The choice of date was deliberate. Monash understood the symbolism of having American troops attack on their Independence Day, but more practically, the timing meant that for the eastward advancing troops, there would be sufficient light to see, but for the enemy facing west, the ground would still be bathed in darkness. As men and tanks finally moved up to their start positions on the night of the 3rd of July, the tension grew, with many of the old sweats reflecting on the battle to come. The Australians watched their American charges with a mixture of concern and something approaching pride. These Yanks had trained hard. They'd listened. They'd learned. Now came the test that no amount of training could truly prepare them for. Edgar Rule recalled the moment. What luck this time? Who would get it in the neck? Did the Hun know we were going to attack? Did he know the time? Was he waiting? What sort of barrage would he put down? Could we get beyond it before it fell? The Americans, for their part, were coiled springs of nervous energy. This was what they had crossed an ocean for. This was the moment they would prove themselves. To the Australians, to their country, to themselves. A few minutes later, and exactly on cue, a flash of light shot out across the battlefield as hundreds of guns roared into life. Captain Lionel Shaw was there and remembered the moment years later. Everything was as still as death, with the intermittent brilliance of the Hun's flares. Every minute or so, Moss would say, "Shorty, what's the time?" I would say, 10 to 3, and so on. The intense, subdued excitement seemed to radiate through the air, and at 3:10 a.m., a leaping line of flame burst on the enemy trenches. The scene was enthralling and tremendous. The din was intolerable. You felt a great pity for the men underneath that fire, yet knew it was your salvation. Beneath that same barrage, whistles blew and the Aussies of 12 battalions with their attached doughboys began to advance toward the mixture of shrapnel and smoke, now inundating the enemy's leading positions. Impressed with the need to stay as close as possible to their friendly barrage, men advanced at speed, which inevitably resulted in some casualties. This determination, however, nearly turned to disaster. As the creeping barrage thundered forward, a curtain of death advancing at a walking pace, the inexperienced Americans, fueled by adrenaline and 3 months of pent-up anticipation, found the pace unbearable. They had trained for this moment. They were ready. And that barrage, that beautiful, terrible barrage, seemed to be moving so slowly. Some of them began to run. They sprinted ahead, rifles clutched to their chests, their legs pumping through the mud, closing the gap between themselves and the wall of explosions that was supposed to protect them. The veteran Australians saw what was happening and reacted on instinct. These men who had been to hell and back, who had learned that survival required patience, threw themselves at the Americans. They tackled them into shell holes, grabbed their webbing, hauled them down into the earth. "Stay down, you bloody idiots!" screamed an Australian sergeant, his face inches from a young American private. "That's our artillery. It'll kill you just as dead as Fritz." The lesson was learned in milliseconds. The Americans, breathing hard, eyes wide, nodded and stayed where they were put. They would advance when the Australians advanced. They would trust the timing. But the moment stayed with them. They had almost killed themselves through sheer zeal, and it was the Australians who had saved them. In the center of the line, the Aussie 15th Battalion soon approached the enemy's strong point at Pear Trench, only to come under heavy, close-range fire from enemy machine guns protected behind uncut barbed wire with their allotted tanks, which had started 4 minutes behind the infantry, nowhere in sight. A company was taking the brunt of the fire. As so often happened in action, one man came to the fore. Private Henry Dalziel, a company transport driver who had volunteered to join the attack, armed only with a revolver, spotted an enemy machine gun through the smoke. Single-handedly, he charged it, vaulting the wire and capturing or killing the entire crew, despite losing his trigger finger to enemy gunfire. His actions saved the lives of many of his mates who were pinned down nearby. Incredibly, despite twice being ordered to seek medical treatment, he would go on in the attack, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire by bringing up ammunition until he was hit in the head, close to the final objective. Evacuated from the battlefield, he would survive his wounds and earn the Victoria Cross for his bravery. This photo, taken shortly after the award of his VC, is fascinating, as beneath his iconic slouch hat can be seen the bandage from the wounds he sustained that day at Hamel. With Pear Trench captured, a key strong point was silenced, but fire from another major position at nearby Kidney Trench was still taking its toll. In a second episode of individual gallantry, Corporal Tom Axford of the 16th Battalion stormed another machine gun, throwing grenades as he ran. Jumping into the position with bayonet fixed, he too silenced his target, breaking the remaining defenders who fled or surrendered. The Americans nearby watched in awe. This was what the Australians had tried to describe in training: the controlled fury, the split-second decisions, the willingness to charge into certain death because it was the only way to save your mates. Axford would also earn the VC that day and live to see the end of the war. As the line pushed on, the leading Australians reached the front edge of Hamel and Vare Woods, where again the fighting became close quarters and bloody. With tanks unable to support in the thick undergrowth, it was down to infantry alone to force their way forward with grenades and bayonets. American soldiers fought alongside Australians in the chaos of the tree line, the distinctions between their units blurring in the smoke and noise. An Australian would clear a bunker. An American would cover the exit. An American would throw a grenade. An Australian would rush in behind it. With incredibly heavy fighting, the combined force pressed on, driving the enemy through the wood or down into their bunkers. At 4:49 a.m., a report reached Monash's headquarters that Vare and Hamel Woods had been taken along with more than 400 German prisoners. For those attacking more open ground, the tanks were worth their weight in gold as they crushed barbed wire, forced the enemy from their trenches, and overran machine guns in an unstoppable advance toward Hamel village. It was here, on the 11th Brigade front, that troops first entered the now fiercely burning village. Working from house to house and cellar to cellar, the Aussies advanced, meeting bewildered enemy along the way, many still wearing gas masks and unaware that the enemy were upon them. The men of the 43rd Battalion leading the attack through the village would later comment on the powerful effect of surprise and how it was vital to success. With some German machine guns found still with their protective covers in place, Within minutes of the attack commencing, Hamel had been entered and cleared of the enemy, with Captain Moran climbing onto the roof of a ruined house to fire 3 green flares and raise the French tricolor in triumph. Their job complete, the 43rd Battalion paused in Hamel. The men of the 44th, in the following wave, pushed on through their ranks to climb the steep rise beyond the village to assault the formidable Wolfsburg. With them were 12 tanks and, importantly, the artillery, which mercilessly swept the ground ahead of them according to schedule. As the 44th crested the hill in a near-perfectly orchestrated assault, the overwhelmed and demoralized enemy had little choice but to surrender or die. Edgar Rule was there and recalled the scene. Out they came, 2 hands up with a loaf of black bread in each, and presently a pair of terrified eyes took a glimpse at me. The Huns came out at once, and when I sized them up, all thoughts of revenge vanished. We could not kill children, and these looked to be barely that. If any of us had been asked how old they were, most of us would have said between 14 and 15, and that was giving them every day of their age. We knew that these babes hadn't pulled the white flag on us. They were too terrified for that, and with the boot to help them along, they ran with their hands above their heads. Incredibly, by 5:13 a.m., when the barrage finally stopped, the Wolfsburg had been captured and was in the process of being consolidated. Hamel and Vere Woods had fallen, and all along the front, the Aussies and their American comrades had captured their objectives. Even the notoriously unreliable tanks had performed flawlessly, with only 3 of the 60 failing to reach their objectives. Their dedicated ammunition carriers had perhaps been the heroes of the day, with more than 120,000 rounds of supplies delivered directly to the heart of the fight, a feat that months before would have taken more than 200 men to accomplish. These supplies were particularly valued when, several hours after the capture of the Wolfsburg, a determined German counterattack struck the Australian line. The Germans threw themselves at the newly captured positions, desperate to retake the ground lost that morning. And it was here, in this desperate moment, that the Americans truly proved themselves. Corporal Thomas Pope of Company E, 131st Infantry Regiment, had watched the Australians all morning. He had seen Dalziel charge that machine gun with nothing but a revolver. He had seen Axford vault into an enemy position with grenades and bayonet. He had absorbed every lesson, every example, every demonstration of what it meant to fight like a man possessed when your mates' lives were on the line. Now, as German machine gun fire raked the Australian positions and men began to fall, Pope didn't hesitate. He wasn't just fighting alongside the Australians anymore. He was fighting like an Australian. With a roar that surprised even himself, Pope launched himself from cover and sprinted directly at the enemy machine gun, the same kind of weapon that had killed so many, the same kind of weapon he'd been taught to fear. His bayonet was fixed, his legs pumped beneath him. The Germans swung the gun toward him, but they were too slow. Pope reached the position and silenced it at the point of the bayonet. The students had become the masters. For his actions that day, Thomas Pope would earn the Medal of Honor, the first American to receive his nation's highest military award in the First World War. But perhaps more importantly, he had earned something else: the respect of the Australians who had taught him everything he knew. Eventually, the Germans were forced back by the combined fury of Australian and American troops, using bayonets, grenades, and trench clubs, leaving behind many fallen in their attempt. All told, the fighting at Le Hamel, lasting a mere 93 minutes, only 3 minutes longer than Monash's pre-battle prediction, was an astounding success, but not one without cost. In that morning's attack, the Australians lost 162 men killed, wounded, or captured, and the Americans a further 176. The German army's toll was some 2,000 men killed or wounded and a further 1,600 taken prisoner, an important loss they could ill afford. So, did the Battle of Hamel win the Great War? No, it didn't. But with the exemplary use of new tactics, innovation, courage, and meticulous planning, it did perhaps show how it could be won. The blueprint laid at Le Hamel, combined arms warfare coordinated with precision timing, would be refined and repeated in the great offensives of August and beyond, eventually driving the German army to defeat. But there was another legacy too, one harder to quantify but perhaps equally important. In the days after the battle, the surviving Americans were different men. They had crossed the threshold that separates soldiers who have trained for war from soldiers who have fought one. And they had crossed it alongside men who had shown them the way. The Australians, for their part, found something they had lost in the years of slaughter: hope. These Americans, their enthusiasm, their willingness to learn, their courage when the test finally came, proved that the war could be won, that reinforcements were coming, that the tide was turning. 2 armies had entered the Battle of Le Hamel. 1 army came out. Of course, the story of the Australian Imperial Force on the Western Front would go on, with many more hard-fought battles to come. If you found this episode interesting, then be sure to check out our other videos in this series to learn more about the Australians in the First World War. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.